everyone. Welcome. Super excited to have you here in Yotpo Revolve and excited to kick off the session, the full picture from acquisition to retention. My name is Kim Winter. I'm the Director of Product Marketing here at Yotpo. And with me here today is Chanel from Shopify. Hi, Chanel.
Hey everyone, thanks for having me. I'm an experimentation and analysis lead at Shopify.
We're going to talk all things retention today, how to look at your whole buyer funnel from a retention mindset. But before we get started, just a quick reminder, we're available on our Revolve community chat in the Yotpo community throughout this whole event. Start discussions, ask us questions. We'll be in answering anything you want post the session. So really excited to communicate with you further after this session. And we've already got some of our team members answering questions from you live throughout the session. So let's get started. So as we all know, over the last couple of years, e-commerce has seen a true acceleration. Would it be the last couple of years through the pandemic, consumer behavior changing? What we know to say for sure is e-commerce is booming. Just take a look at the amount of Shopify brands that are joining year over year. That's not going to stop. E-commerce is how consumers now shop, and therefore more and more brands are going to enter the space, right? But as with every industry that's going, there's always changes, always new things that are happening that require brands to adapt, as well as us here at Yotpo and Shopify to help you all grow, right? So a couple of two big changes that Chanel and I really want to focus on today is one big change for you guys, for the brands, right? We're seeing customer acquisition costs rise higher than ever before. It's harder and much more costly for brands to win over new shoppers, right? Whether it be the new privacy changes, the fact that ad measurements have worsened. We know acquiring new customers is one of the most challenging things in today's age and time. In parallel to that challenge, right, things are happening on a consumer side. And what's really nice about e-commerce is both Chanel and I are consumers, you're consumers too, right? So we actually know what's happening in consumers and how things are changing, right? Well, the market is being dominated by the high inflation. Consumers are also trying more new brands than ever before, which means that brands are having to compete for attention when consumers are probably a bit less eager to buy nowadays than they were a couple months ago, right? So all in all, this presents new challenges and requires brands to take kind of a step back and align on what their strategy is going to be over the next couple of months to win. It's harder than ever before for brands to focus on acquisition alone as a result of this, right? Our brands need to find a way to continue to grow and grow in a way that's sustainable and that's aligned with what the market needs right now. So Chanel, would love to hear a bit from you. What are you seeing on your end right now? How are brands adapting to this new stage?
Yeah, for sure. I think that top of funnel or like acquisition has always kind of gotten the sexier cut, right? Like even if it's not as impactful to the bottom line, it is easier to see changes up there. There's a bigger sample size. And honestly, acquisition dominates a lot of our copy and call to action efforts as well. I think retention is usually confined or like exiled almost to email and post-conversion.
Right.
Yes, yeah, and post-conversion landing pages, sometimes push notifications. And I guess like my question around that, especially for e-commerce, where it's not software and it's this clear line between potential lead and customer, like why are we exiling retention? The same people who have been your customers are coming to your website the same as they are for acquisition. And so I think kind of thinking about them in a less siloed way and thinking about how acquisition feeds into retention and vice versa is really, really important. And I think brands are still, as far as I'm seeing across the board in e-commerce, are spending the majority of their resources on the stages of acquisition, from like awareness through to the eventual like first purchase.
Totally. And we see the same, we speak to a lot of brands, obviously, and we keep hearing 80% of resources go towards acquisition, right? So the purpose, obviously, you need to continue acquiring new customers. That's never going to change. And I think acquisition is always going to be fundamental in our industry because that's one of the ways to grow, right? But the question is like, do all 80% of resources truly need to go to acquisition, Or do you need to make sure that you're actually balancing out between your retention and acquisition resources? And also, where does the connection lie between the two? I think that's where it gets really interesting. When we see brands succeed is when they take that step back and they're saying, oh, this is not two separate efforts. It's actually,
Right.
One effort. There's one buyer journey, and I have a variety of different sort of customer segments that I need to optimize for, right? And the mistake a lot of brands made is they're optimizing just for that new customer that arrives on the website. Like you said, what happens to us, to the repeat customers? Shouldn't the customer experience be that much more easier, that much better, more personalized, things like that? So we'll talk about that today. Another really interesting thing I wanted to share, and Chanel and I were obviously talking a bit about this before, this is big, right? What we're hearing is that brands understand the value of retention in today's age and time. So more than 52% of you all told us that you're focused on retention more than they were last year. So that means that, the changes we just described, they're happening to everybody. Everyone's thinking how to shift, and they're shifting towards retention. But what we found the most interesting when we were kind of prepping on what to show you today and what to speak about in Revolve is that still almost half, over 40%, haven't made any changes, right? So that means that, people want to double down on it, but they don't know how, because for so many years, the D2C playbook, like Chanel and I just spoke about, has been just about acquisition, retention, sort of like that afterthought. So brands are now challenged with this idea of, how do I even approach it? What do I even do it? Also in this survey, 1/3 out of each brands told us that essentially they're missing that clear playbook. Like, hey, Yotpo, Shopify, just give me a clear playbook. How do I approach retention in today's age and time? So hopefully with a bit more kind of this session, of the upcoming sessions in Revolve, you can get that playbook. So Chanel, with that, everybody on this call that's joining us thinks that retention is complex. Let's kind of open up the book and explain how you look at retention over at Shopify.
Yeah, for sure. I think I totally agree with you. Like, I think that we all intuitively know that retention is important and that we should be thinking about it. I don't think any of the stats that you see here are surprising. I think they're familiar. We've heard them before. We know that acquiring new customers is more expensive than retaining existing customers. We also, I think another version of the Pareto principle, the 80-20 rule, is that 80% of your revenue comes from 20% of your customers. But as you said, it's complex. We also know that it's super fickle. It only takes 1 to 2 bad experiences to lose a customer forever. I think 33% of US customers consider switching companies immediately after a poor customer service experience. And then that number jumps to 60% at the second instance.
Insane.
Yeah, it's wild. And then, we also know unhappy customers share much more widely than happy customers. And to make that even more difficult, we also know that customers don't trust us as much as they trust one another. It makes it really, really hard to forge these really long-lasting, high-trust relationships with customers. 81% of customers trust recommendations from friends over business advice. Unsurprisingly, 65% don't trust ads. And surprisingly, 71% don't trust sponsored social media ads in particular. I thought that was interesting. Yeah. But I think, like, all this to say, like, if you get it right, retention is really, really valuable, and it's much more lucrative than focusing on acquisition. The ROI of an existing customer is higher than the ROI of a new customer. There's been studies that have been conducted that show a 5% increase in customer retention correlates with at least a 25% increase in profit. And then there's a ton of data around how emotionally invested customers perform versus customers who are just pretty happy, which I think is also very impressive. So like an emotionally invested customer will spend about $699 with a company annually, while a regular, just kind of happy customer will spend only about $275. And then, finally, I guess, like, loyal customers will not only purchase more frequently, but they will purchase higher volumes from their preferred companies. So I think this really, like, further paints the picture you were starting of. We know that retention is important. We know that it's complex. And we know that if we get it right, it can be very lucrative, but it's still kind of this mystery box.
Totally. It's worth it. It's a mystery box. And what I found super interesting by kind of the stats you mentioned in regards to the port experience is that, like, creating that perfect experience or focusing on that experience for the loyal customer, for the customer that we're trying to get to be emotionally invested, that's what's going to really up the retention metrics that we're talking about, right? So that I think is really important. And that's why you can't look at things siloed. I think when you begin to think that it's all about the experience that you're giving your loyal customers and how you treat them, then looking at things siloed just can't happen, because your website, your emails, your SMS messages, everything you do serves kind of both audiences, and you need to find a way to kind of build that correct strategy, right? So we spoke about this. This is not new, right? Our approach or our recommendation from this session, right, is that you need to look at everything with a retention mindset. You need to look at your whole buyer journey from the very beginning all the way to the end, also from a retention mindset. I read a really interesting blog the other day, basically said, those that are succeeding are also thinking about acquisition as a retention tool. And that is true, right? Because the customers you acquire will hopefully be those loyal customers. That means you need to help customers come to your site and from the get-go shop the right product to them, from the get-go get the right experience, and from the get-go get an experience that's going to make them more likely in the future to be an invested customer, like Chanel was talking about, right? So you're no longer simply acquiring customers, you're actually acquiring relationships. You're actually getting to know the customer and building the experience that's actually right for them. Chanel, let's talk a bit about relationships. How do you view it? Like, what does it mean to actually build good relationships?
Yeah, I mean, I think for the most part, it starts with great understanding of who your customers are. But I think the ways in which I'm seeing people start to think about retention is kind of thinking beyond that, like reactivation or they're just about to churn state. I think there's a lot that can be done before that. And for me, that usually boils down to people starting to think about purchase frequency optimization as well as average order value optimization.
That's huge. And another point from the study, we didn't put here on the slide, but it's actually one of my favorite ones, is that over half of merchants basically told us that when we asked them, what are your challenges with retention? Like, okay, it's important. You don't know the playbook, you're missing it, but what else is the challenge? They spoke to us about the engagements between purchases. And I think that's so important, right? So Chanel, it sounds like you're basically saying like, hey, don't just build a win back flow once they've already churned or once they're already likely to churn, right? But how do you engage with customers in between the purchase? How do you build kind of those touch points here and then to get them excited, to make them feel part of the brand? And definitely, I think like optimizing for purchase frequency, for average order optimization is going to be huge. Just constantly reactivating the customers versus being in the state of, oh, I think they're going to churn or they churned, and how do I kind of win them back again? You also mentioned something really important, which is getting to know the customers. I'd love for you to kind of double tap on that. I think that's a huge one with a retention mindset.
Yeah, for sure. I think when people think about research or data that they can look at when it comes to retention, they think of very quantitative data. And I also would encourage people to think about the qualitative side. As you kind of alluded to, what is happening at the acquisition level can very much inform and should very much inform what you're doing at the retention level. And so I think the like standby qualitative research methods of like exit surveys, on-site surveys, customer surveys, user testing, user interviews, and session replays would be where I would start. So with anything that's at the top of the funnel, when we're looking at more of that like stereotypical or like siloed acquisition phase, I'm looking at like where are people pausing and where are they giving up when they're navigating my website. And I'm using insights to gather information on first-time customers as well as like poor performing parts of my website, which can be informed by that quantitative layer that we talked about. And then when I'm looking at the kind of like on-site survey or user testing, I'm really looking to understand like where the friction is and where people are struggling, as I mentioned, like where they're pausing, where they're giving up. I'd be asking questions like, what was the purpose of their visit? Were they able to complete the purpose of their visit? If not, why? Is there anything that was holding them back? Did they have any unanswered questions? And then moving into this like very valuable stage of a first-time buyer right after their first purchase, I would be looking to kind of get to know who they are and what matters to them. so that I can use that in my retention strategy and all of the nurture that comes in those like in between moments that you mentioned, but then also so that I can feed that back into acquisition, and I can try to target more of those customers in the future.
Right. Bring the loyal customers, so to speak, or the right customers already through the acquisition funnel as well.
Right, exactly. So in that case, I'm kind of looking at like actually getting to the meat of like, who are you? What are you using this product for? Like what problem does it solve for you? What do you like about the product most? Did you consider alternatives? And what did you see in our competitors that made you choose us? What's the thing that nearly stopped you from buying? What was your biggest fear or concern? I think that's also very important. As an example, I would take that and use that like voice of customer copy that they just gave me of what their concerns were, and make sure I added that back into my landing pages to reduce that fear for future people who are coming through. And then, of course, like I don't mean to imply that we should ignore quantitative. I do think that it's important. I think understanding people based on their data, especially from multiple sources, is really, really important. But I would, again, really emphasize not to silo the two. Make sure that top of funnel is informing bottom of the funnel, and don't silo the data as well as the people. And in the quantitative realm, I'm looking at like, what is their search behavior, purchase behavior, what categories do they have a preference for, common product pairing, incentive acceptance rates, I think is also very interesting, purchase frequency and average order value again. Maybe I'm looking at the navigation summary report in Google Analytics to see how they're traveling between my funnel. I think we think funnels are very linear and like straightforward, and it makes sense that it's just easier to talk about them that way, but it's usually more of like a tornado. And so understanding how people get to the conversion, I think, is also really important. And you can do that all through the quantitative side to build like a holistic customer profile.
I think this is super important. And I love the way, actionable tips on how, if you get to know your customer, if you think with a retention mindset, you can infuse your acquisition strategy so that it goes along with it. One of our brands, I spoke to them last week. They told me something that really resonated with me. They're like, hey, if I don't get reviews from my customers, if I don't understand what my customers loved, didn't love, what they were thinking about, how can I even help acquiring customers, or how can I help the traffic that comes to the website in getting and converting on the product that's going to get them to stay for the long term? So that really resonated with me, as well as what you spoke about the journey, right? Because at the end of the day, this getting to know the customer, it's what's going to fuel all those engagements between touch points that our customers were saying that they have trouble with, that brands want to start building to increase that purchase frequency. So that's really important, right? Getting to know them, building the funnel that's actually relevant for them, and actually the right engagement based on where they are, what they did, which actions they took, what we already know about them, etc. So this is definitely going to be one of the most critical ones. And I know there are a couple more sessions throughout Revolve to talk about data and what it means to combine your whole data and to get into that holistic customer profile sense. So there's more to come on that, but this was already, in my point of view, really, really impactful way to kind of pillar it out and work through it. Let's talk about, how once you have this data and once you start thinking about getting to know your customer, how you can actually drive retention.
Yeah, for sure. I talk a lot about the multiplier formula, which was introduced to me by Drew Sanaki, but it's been a theory that's been around for a very long time, and it's essentially states that the number of customers times the purchase frequency times the average order value is e-commerce growth. And so if you were looking to double revenue, that's like a big, hairy problem, and we wouldn't really know how to start tackling it. There are a million different ways we could go after it. But this theory states that if you just increase each of those multipliers by 30% in 1 year, you can double your revenue in 1 year, which I think is very accessible. It makes it much more easier to break down the problem into these three pillars that you can focus on separately and try to increase by 30% at the same time. And would definitely call attention to the fact that 2 of those 3 multipliers are focused on retention. So purchase frequency and average order value.
Totally. And that, so it really shows it on a, looking at a formula, it's like, oh, wait, my sustainable way to grow my business is actually 2 metrics that have to do, with my retention, with my repeat customers, which I think is really important.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, like, honestly, I think I kind of mentioned this briefly earlier, but I feel like one of the main advantages that e-commerce in particular has is that your repeat customers and your new customers are all hanging out in the same area. They're following the same flows. One group isn't like siphoned off into this area that everyone else can't access. And so I think thinking about them together, like you mentioned, is very, very important. So anyways, when you start to think about kind of like experimenting or optimizing around these multipliers, I think is when you start to realize maybe why we think that the bottom of the funnel is a little bit more complex. It's much, much easier to experiment at the top of the funnel in most cases. There is way less complexity at the top of the funnel. There's less nuance. It's easier to define your metrics. Like, I don't know if anyone's ever tried to define an LTV metric. It's very, very hard.
Complex.
Yeah. It's easy, like it's faster to see wins at the top of the funnel. And then you don't need to worry about like very nuanced things like the cannibalization of financial incentives. Like, did you really need to offer that financial incentive, or would they have converted anyway? Experimenting with small sample sizes, like when we kind of are regulated to email lists and like post-conversion landing pages, there's a lot fewer people visiting those pages, which makes it harder to run a controlled experiment. And then of course, like proxy metrics, I think are also quite difficult in the sense that often if you can't get to something like an LTV, if you want something that could be like a leading indicator, defining those is also quite difficult. But I think given that we know all of these problem areas, there are some like common mistakes that we can try to avoid ahead of time. I think the first one, not just with retention, is to really understand whether you need to run a controlled experiment or not. You don't always, you can sometimes just do a pre-post. Really, I would recommend a controlled experiment if you want to be able to say we are X% certain that we cause Y results. And often we don't need to be that certain. We just need to know if it's directionally doing the right thing. So that would be the first one. And then I think getting into like understanding when your experiments are overlapping, especially like if you're running experiments at the top of the funnel, are the assignments like putting people into control or variant, are those assignments persisting down to your bottom of funnel experiments, as well as kind of thinking about those small sample sizes and being aware of when you need to run a controlled experiment or not, and thinking about financial incentives very, very seriously. I think that would be an example of when I would definitely recommend running a controlled A/B test so that you can really understand whether your financial incentive caused the change or if it would have happened anyways.
Right. And I think, incentives and what products we offer and all that, that's really where brands can start experimenting and playing with what their retention journey looks like, right? Even getting as kind of smart as saying, after someone purchased this product, this is the right product to offer them next. And this incentive is what tends to work, right? That combination of understanding so you can start building what that funnel looks like, that's going to drive a lot of that retention decisions and the right type of touch points throughout the customer lifecycle.
Totally.
Awesome. Talk to us a bit about, the different marketing channels and strategies that you see brands adopting to kind of build out this whole funnel.
Yeah, for sure. I think you honestly might be a little bit more of an expert here than me, but I definitely see folks using email and like SMS push notifications, those like 3 categories more often than anything. I think also people are starting to explore like loyalty programs. But beyond that, I do feel like for the most part, I still see retention very regulated to these like predefined retention channels.
Yeah, no, really, really interesting. And the reason I asked is also, you speak to customers, you're seeing also the full picture as well. What we're seeing here, right? And we've spoken to a lot of customers, both on the survey that we mentioned earlier before, as well as just like helping brands with their retention strategy constantly across all of Yotpo's solution, right? Is what we're seeing drive the most success is when our customers use connected marketing channels to actually drive retention, right? So if we said that retention is siloed from acquisition, one of the things that hurts the most is also that the way we work in e-commerce is so siloed. So we have this channel, this effort, this solution, and it's like, oh, this only helps with retention. This only helps with acquisition. It only helps loyalty members, but it's not for the whole like customer, right? We're siloing so much of the efforts that we do. And I think the purpose or the takeaway that I would take from this whole session is like, hey, like, let's stop being siloed. Let's look at everything from a retention mindset, because, you know, and I love that formula. It just puts it out there. You want to grow in a sustainable way. You can't ignore retention anymore. And in order to do things correctly for retention, it requires a holistic view, something that sometimes is not needed for acquisition. A bit simpler, not getting simpler with the changes happening in the space, but still a bit simpler, a bit more easy, right? All you're looking in is new traffic and new sales kind of coming in, whereas retention more complex. And the way to do that really well is only to combine connected marketing channels. So the top marketing channels we see and we help brands with, and we help brands connect the dots here at Yotpo, is the loyalty program, customer community, which is truly on the rise, and it's just amazing. I really urge everybody on this call to join a couple of the customer communities out there, see what brands are talking about, what interests them. That's a really great way to get to know your customers, right? And hear them out, what they like about the products, which incentives they like, what they're talking about in the group, which questions they have. That, just think how much insight that brings into bringing the right customer. So definitely customer community, email and SMS marketing channels that we spoke about. Those are huge. Other than the fact that you control these marketing channels and you control the engagements, that coupled with the loyalty program, with the customer community, with efforts like subscription, like referrals, so much of your data can live inside email and SMS, and that can fuel your whole retention strategy. So that's huge. We see social media engagement, referrals, subscriptions, etc. And coupling all those together, building that connected strategy, that's going to drive retention. I actually have a session coming up on Revolve, which is how to build an omni-channel strategy towards retention. So hopefully everyone that's here with us will also join me on this workshop. I show examples of how to build different experiences through all these channels and how all these channels can connect to one another. And what's really exciting is that our customers are asking us to connect these channels, right? So even when you go to brands that haven't yet connected these channels together into one strategy, you log into their customer community, it bubbles up from the customers themselves, right? So you start seeing the customers, actually, Chanel, they're talking and they're like, hey, I got this incentive. Hey, have you joined the loyalty program? Did you know that once you get to this VIP tier, you can do this? They're talking and they're referring one another. They're talking about whether they can be a subscriber and actually have a subscription to a brand they love. So it's almost like you're seeing that the customers themselves are saying to the brand, like, hey, here's what I want you to do. Here's the channels you need. And you need all of them to work together to build that really great experiences. So more to come on that. And hopefully everybody here will join me on the workshop. So that was kind of it from us today. Huge thank you for joining us, and huge thank you to Chanel for also giving her insight and looking at the whole buyer funnel and so many insights that Shopify has, right, in regards to kind of who's landing on the page, what they do, how they engage, and so much of that knowledge pertains to how we approach retention. We'll be on the customer community next to answer any questions with our team, so feel free to ask away. And thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Chanel.